I have everything laid out on the table that I need to create a gridded self-portrait. I started by taking a self-portrait with my phone, putting that into an editing program, and overlaying a grid of 12 by 12 squares. My 12 by 12 inch paper is going to have 1 inch boxes or squares laid out over it to match. I need to make sure that I've got 12 rows and columns on the image over here and that matches this. I've measured this and cut it down to 12 inches by 12 inches. I have a ruler that I'm going to use to mark my inch marks, and then I've got some pencils laid out. I'm going to use the ebony pencil and the blending stick to do the actual values after I've laid out the sketch on my grid. I'm going to use just a regular HB or 2B pencil and use really light pressure to create a light grid of 12 squares across here. Check my ruler and I see that the 0 mark is up against the edge of the page. Your ruler might have a 0 mark, or it may just start at the end of the ruler, so double check that. I'm going to very lightly mark the 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And the 12 is right at the edge of my paper, so I don't need to mark that. That will just be where my grid stops. And I slid that straight down to the bottom. I'm going to mark both sides because I don't want there to be any skew in my lines. They need to be parallel to the sides of the paper. I want to use my ruler to make these lines as straight as possible. And I'm going to line it up, double check that both points are just on the edge of the ruler, and slide my pencil across, line it back up if I need to address any area that got missed. Ideally, these lines are light enough that I can see them while I'm working on the drawing, but if I were looking at this from across the room, I might not even be able to see those lines. Right now I'm making them just slightly darker so that they show up in the video for the second part of this demo. If you're having a hard time using light pressure, try holding the pencil a little bit further back. I'm putting almost no pressure on as I'm dragging it along the ruler. Because I'm using an HB pencil, these lines shouldn't smear as much as they would if I was using the ebony pencil or a soft lead pencil. They also are going to be relatively easy to erase. All of my lines look pretty parallel, they look even, and they look consistent. I'm going to lightly number down to 12. All right, I've got my 12 rows. I'm going to create the columns now. So I need to start along the side that doesn't have any marks yet and mark every inch again. I will slide my ruler down to the bottom, make sure it's lined up, and mark the inches again. I now have my vertical and horizontal lines. I'm going to go ahead and mark over along the top, numbering each box. Doing that very lightly so I can erase those as well. I've numbered 1 through 12 this way, 1 through 12 this way. I have a grid that is visible, but is also going to be easy to erase with a kneaded eraser once I've translated my drawing on here. Now that I have my grid laid out and numbered, I've also numbered those same boxes on my image. I'm gonna just check that I've got 12. When I've numbered that out, each one of those squares is going to correspond to one of these squares. I can quickly look down and see that in the first column, the third row up is number 10, and that's where the start of my shoulder is. So I want to copy that across. I can follow that line, and I really want to think about this as like copying across the grid lines and just using the individual boxes to check that things are where they need to be. My image is being blown up about 25%. We've got 1-inch boxes here. These are roughly 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to end up with an overall larger image, and that needs to reflect that. I want to pay special attention to my facial features and how they fit on the grid versus how I know they should fit on the proportions of the face. My nose line is falling right here on the 6th row down. So even though I know it should be centered in the center of my face, the way that my head is turned has changed that. And there's some distortion from the camera from being very close up that causes some foreshortening. So my forehead is shortened and the eye line that I've got is slightly diagonal from the turn of my head. So there's all sorts of little things that I want to double check with here versus what I think should be there. I'm going to use the photo to capture this in a way that I wouldn't probably get if I was just looking into a mirror. Again, I'm not shading things in, I'm just indicating where there is going to be some shading to show the eyebrow. I'm not going to heavily outline my nose, I just want to indicate where the bridge of my nose might be or the edge. Gotten to the point where I made some corrections. I had dropped my chin a little bit here because of the distortion of the camera. I realized it actually came down a little bit lower. It wasn't quite fitting. I knew that it looked a little bit short. It looks a little bit long just from the distortion right now. Once the shading is in, this will start to come to life a little bit more. I've darkened in a little bit of the detailing around the eyes, the lips, the areas that are going to have some pretty dark value to begin with, and I'm going to use my kneadable eraser to start getting rid of my grid lines so I can begin the shading process. Up here in the hair, I've just indicated the areas where I can see a value difference. So I'm not drawing the texture of my hair. I'm going to go for the general shading in there first. Then I will work on the texture and defining some of the lines of the hair. Same goes for the beard, same goes for the sweatshirt. The blending on the sweatshirt and on the skin be much more of a soft blend, whereas something relatively reflective like the hair or the eyes, you might get a little bit more defined of a highlight. Now that I've erased the grid lines in my face, on the hoodie, and just around the outside. I've left them on the outside so that I could reset up my grid if I needed to make a correction in here. But I can start the light shading. I've already started to work in here on the nose, around the mouth. I'm using the HB pencil right now. I'm just going to lay in light shading with that using long strokes along the direction of shadow. There's really not much in my image. That would be the white of the paper, maybe some highlight in the eye. But in general, all the skin is going to have some light shading as well as the hair. I'm going to use my ebony pencil for the heavier shading in a moment. But right now, I'm going to just get this stuff all marked out. I don't want to shade over details I've already drawn unless I can darken some of those in as I work. Most of the really dark values I want to shade mostly with my ebony pencil. So I'm just going to add a little bit here to define the eyebrow again. I want to start to really look at the different values and make sure that I'm defining things. So the roundness of the forehead wraps around and I see kind of 3 distinct values, even though I will blend those together in a moment. Not worried about texture at this point. I'm mostly worried about just making the value that I can see on the skin match what I see in the printout or on my screen. At this point, I've really softened a lot of the lighter blending around my skin. There's some areas that I'll need to darken up. Specifically, I'm going to go back and start hitting the heavy darks with my ebony pencil now. So I know this is going to be about as black or as dark as I can make it with my ebony pencil. Just like before, I'm not specifically worried about the texture just yet. I will adjust that as I go. I just want to get the values in the right spots. Now that the skin is darkened, I can start to look at where some of the darker values need to get even darker. I've really gone through and touched up some of the darker areas. We'll talk more about the texture in the hair when we get up here. I've also started to lay out some of the general shading in the hair. Where it's mostly dark, I'm just shading it fairly solid, and then where I see a little bit of highlight, still using the ebony pencil but leaving it quite a bit lighter with my pressure. Make a note of any areas that I see kind of a wave or a shape of darkness, but I'm being very general. The texture will come after I blend and soften this. There's also some parts that I've kind of neglected. I was working on the eyes and around those details. I'm going to add some of the darker values in here along the ear and beard and mouth. I'm going to start inside here with some dark shading. I think I'm going to have to refer back to the photo without the grid lines to really look at some of the details in here that aren't very clear in the printout. But in general, I can see, I'm going to shade kind of up to the tooth, and I can see my tongue is not going to be as dark as the rest to the sides. My blending stump is starting to get kind of dirty. I can use a fine grit sandpaper and take some of that off. It's not a tool that I would want to stick in a pencil sharpener.